Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Abstract, the show where we take academic research and make it sound like something you'd actually want to listen to on your commute. I'm your host, and today we're talking about a really interesting qualitative study from Indonesia about teaching English to students who are visually impaired. The study we're looking at is by Susanto and Nanda, published in 2018, and it's called Teaching and Learning English for Visually Impaired Students, an ethnographic case study using the step-by-step critique framework from Ryan, Kulan, and Cronin in 2007. Don't worry, this won't be a quantitative episode. This is more, did the study make sense? Can we trust it? And what can teachers actually do with this? So let's dive in. First, the big picture. In Indonesia, like in many countries, English is a compulsory subject in school. That includes special schools, called SLB schools in Indonesia, that serve students with disabilities. Now, here's the problem the authors noticed. English is often taught in very visual ways. Think pictures, writing on the board, pointing to text, textbooks designed for sighted students. But what happens if your students are blind or have low vision? That's the question Susanto and Nanda wanted to explore. So they went into a special school in Bandar Lampung and spent time there, observing, interviewing, basically watching how teachers and students actually do English lessons in real life and actually teaching some classes. We're going to use Ryan et al.'s framework, which look at things like, is the title clear? Do the authors have the right background? Is the method explained? Is it rigorous? All those things that make research trustworthy. Let's start with believability, and the study does pretty well here. Ryan and their colleagues say a good qualitative paper should tell you right away what it's about, and the title does exactly that. It tells us what, teaching and learning English, with whom, visually impaired students, and how, an ethnographic case study. So from the title alone, we know what we're getting. Then we can look at the authors. Are they qualified? Yes. Both authors are from an English education department in Indonesia. That matters because this isn't just a disability study, it's a foreign language teaching study in a very specific national context. So the authors being insiders to that education system helps us trust that they understood the curriculum, the school structures, and the expectations. The abstract is also solid. It tells us, here's the problem. English isn't being adapted enough. Here's the setting. A special school in Indonesia. Here are the participants, teachers and students at one of those special schools. Here's what we did, observations, interviews, and teaching lessons. And here's what we found. Students can learn and are using assistive technology, but teachers aren't always modifying lessons. So on do I trust what I'm about to read? The answer is yeah. Now let's talk about the problem and research questions, because this is where qualitative studies sometimes get a little fuzzy. Susanto and Nanda start with a very simple observation. English is required, but a lot of English lessons are sight-based, and many teachers don't fully understand the learning implications of visual impairment. From that, they asked 3 research questions. What strategies do teachers and students actually use? What do students think about learning English? And what does this mean for practice and future research? It's a really nice, logical flow. The only thing missing, it's really small, but they don't write one clear, single-purpose statement like, the purpose of this study was to... ... And according to Ryan and colleagues' paper, that makes it easier for readers and for us to go back at the end and say, did you actually do what you said? So really good logic and just a tiny clarity issue. Next, the literature review. And this part is actually really interesting because it teaches us about Indonesia. They explain how SLB schools work, they talk about different types of special schools and their codes, and they bring in other writers to make a really important point. Curriculum should not just be available, it should be accessible. In other words, if you say all students must learn English, but then you only teach it in visual ways, that's basically just excluding them. So content-wise, the literature review does its job, but the review is a bit more descriptive than critical. It tells us what is out there, but it doesn't strongly say, here's a gap. And that's the kind of sentences that make a study feel necessary. Something like, we don't actually know how Indonesian students with visual impairment are learning EFL. using tools like NVDA or JAWS. So really good context with a small gap. Now, this is what I think is the best part of the article, is the theoretical framework. So let's talk about it. Susanto and Nanda say outright, we're using a social constructivist view of disability. If you're not familiar with this field, the simple version is that disability is not just in the person. Disability happens when the environment puts up barriers. So if a student can learn English through audio, like by using a screen reader to access materials, but the school insists on visuals or braille only, then the school is creating disability through the social constructivist view of disability. That fits perfectly with a classroom study, and even better, the authors actually use the framework later. They showed that if the teachers only use visual materials or only braille without checking the student's preferred mode, then they might accidentally make learning harder. But if they allow screen readers, audio, music, role play, these kinds of things, students participate more. So on the theory, I think it's very strong here. Now let's talk methods. They say this is an ethnographic case study in one SLB school in Lampung over 3 months. They worked with 3 teachers and 15 students. That's a reasonable, purposeful sample for qualitative research. The data collection is quite nicely described. They did participant observation, so they weren't just sitting in the back taking notes, but they also took part. So they're using audio and video recording, field notes, semi-structured interviews with the teachers and the students, and they're even teaching some of the classes. And they even included some of the interview questions in the article. So that's really good transparency. But as far as ethics, were participants informed? Was permission granted? Was confidentiality explained? In this study, there's no separate ethics section, which is a bit of a problem because there were minors involved. It doesn't mean the study was unethical, it just means it wasn't reported, and reporting is part of rigor. Second, in the data analysis section, the authors say themes emerged from the data and that they used investigator and methodological triangulation, which is good, but they don't show us the actual coding trail. They don't tell us, first we transcribed, then we coded, then we grouped codes into themes, blah, blah, blah. We could call this a weakness in dependability and confirmability because another researcher couldn't easily repeat the process. So the method was clear, but it's a little bit light in the ethics reporting and the analysis description. So what did they actually learn? The headline finding is very positive. Visually impaired students in Indonesia can learn English, and many of them are already doing it using assistive technology and creative strategies. Students were using things like NVDA, JAWS, Braille, music, and role play to access their curriculum, even when all teachers didn't fully adapt their lessons. That's important because a lot of the time, learners with visual impairments are talked about in terms of limitations. They can't access this, they can't do that. This study flips it and says, actually, they are doing it, and maybe the curriculum and the teaching methods need to catch up. The authors also say that these abilities should be recognized. That's a nice connection back to the social constructivist framework. If students are already succeeding with certain tools, the barrier is not necessarily their impairment, it's the school's lack of adaptation. Where the study could have maybe pushed it a little bit further is in the recommendations. Based on what they saw, they could have said teachers should be trained in using screen readers in English as a foreign language. Schools should officially support screen readers in English classes. And the national curriculum should include guidelines for accessible foreign language teaching. These recommendations are kind of implied, but not stated strongly. And now the last piece. Why does this matter? Why should we care? It matters because of a lot of education systems around the world are now saying we're inclusive, but inclusion doesn't just mean everyone comes to school. It means the content is actually learnable, it's actually accessible. This study shows that students with visual impairment are doing their part. They're learning, they're using tech, they're motivated, and now the system has to also do its part and make the instruction accessible. And for teacher educators, this study is a great example to show students, here's what an ethnographic study looks like, here's what to look for in a critique, and here's how theory can actually guide practice. That's it for today's episode of Beyond the Abstract. We looked at Susanto and Nanda through Ryan, Kulan, and Cronin's 2007 framework and saw that good qualitative research doesn't have to be complicated, it just has to be transparent, connected to theory, and honest about its limitations. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.